Hi, my name is Abigail Edwards, and today I'll be presenting on psychological ownership and identity motives in blood donation. This work was done in collaboration with Fiona Barlow and Barbara Massa at the University of Queensland, Australia. I'd like to begin this presentation by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands from which I'm recording on today, the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So, in Australia, around 26.5% of first-time blood donors don't return to donate again. And although this attrition is highest between the first and second donation, we can lose donors at any stage of the donor career. As such, I argue that interventions to retain existing donors are key for increasing our current donor panel. So, blood donor identity, or being a blood donor, is one proposed motivational mechanism for this sustained blood donation behaviour. Based in identity theory, the model goes that our first-time blood donor is motivated to donate blood by external factors, such as social pressure. However, as our first-time blood donor keeps donating blood, they develop this increased familiarity with the blood donation process. And then this increased familiarity fosters a blood donor role identity around the donation process. Further, with repeat donation behaviour, this role identity keeps getting continuously validated until our blood donor has developed a sense of self-identity around being a blood donor. As such, repeat donation behaviour is the key way of developing this donor self-identity. And further, older studies have found a direct relationship between donor self-identity and future intentions to donate blood. So, in keeping with this identity theory perspective, if the only way to motivate someone to donate blood is this donor self-identity, and the only way to foster a donor self-identity is through this repeat donation behaviour, then we've created this circular system where the only way we have to get people to donate blood is to get them to donate blood. To date, there's only been one study which has looked at developing this self-identity outside of just repeat donation behaviour. This was conducted by Collier and Calero in a recycling context and required an intensive 6-week intervention, which I argue is not directly transferable to a context like blood donation, where the resources of blood collection agencies and donor contact time are restricted. As such, I'm arguing that we need to develop novel interventions to foster a donor self-identity outside of just repeat donation behaviour. So this is where psychological ownership comes into play. So psychological ownership is this concept from the broader organisational literature, which at its core is this sense of being psychologically tied to a possession. So in a psychological ownership context, a possession can be anything from a material object, like a blood collection agency, to a more abstract concept, like the act of donating blood. It's worth noting that in an Australian context, where the Australian Red Cross Lifeblood is the sole blood collection agency, we don't expect to see a distinction in the psychological ownership donors experience towards a blood collection agency and the act of donating blood. But regardless of what that possession is, within psychological ownership, these possessions feel so much like ours that they form a part of our identity. And in this way, ownership and identity are associated. Ainsworth, in the first study to look at psychological ownership in this non-profit context, found that psychological ownership was mediating this relationship between past volunteering behaviour and future intentions to volunteer for the same organisation. This finding suggests that strengthening psychological ownership over a blood collection agency may serve as an effective means to strengthen future intentions to donate blood. As such, the key aim of our study was to explore this relationship between past donation behaviour, future intentions to donate blood, as potentially mediated by psychological ownership and donor self-identity. So to do this, we initially recruited 255 donor participants through a combination of prolific academic and directly through an online blood donor community group. So participants were presented with an online survey where they were asked about their donation history, which we then operationalised as number of donations made in the past 2 years. We then measured psychological ownership towards a blood collection agency, donor self-identity, and future intentions to donate blood using previously established measures. So our main analysis was then a test of our model using serial mediation. So what we found firstly was the significant indirect effect of past donation behaviour on intention via self-identity. And so this supports that identity theory model of donation behaviour, where the more a donor donates blood, the more they begin to feel like they are a blood donor, and then this motivates future intentions to donate blood. Our next finding in this model was then the significant indirect effect of past donation behaviour on intention via both psychological ownership and identity. And so what this is suggesting is that past donation behaviour is leading to an increased sense of ownership over a blood collection agency, which is then positively influencing donor self-identity and future intentions to donate blood. So it's worth reiterating again that this is cross-sectional data, and so we can't make causal claims. But what we have here is very initial evidence for this pathway where how much someone donates blood leads to an increase in psychological ownership, which leads to an increase in this donor self-identity, which is leading to subsequent intentions to donate blood in the future. So to further explore this relationship between past donation behaviour and psychological ownership, we conducted the same survey again with an additional non-donor population group. So we divided our non-donors into non-donors and lapsed donors, and we defined lapsed donors as blood donors who hadn't donated blood in the past 2 years. So in addition, we also divided up our original donor population into super donors and donors. So participants who were recruited through prolific academic were labelled donors, and participants recruited through that online blood donor community page were labelled as super donors. So this super donors labels was reflecting the high amount of engagement we were expecting from this donor population group, both based off the fact that they had all elected to be part of this blood donor community page, and it's also seen in the high number of blood donations this group had made in the past 2 years. So based off the fact that our 4 donor groups were reflecting these 4 distinct stages in the donor career, what we were expecting was this stepwise pattern of results, where our super donors would be experiencing the most of our 3 constructs, so psychological ownership, self-identity, and intention to donate blood, and this would be followed by our donors, then lapsed donors, and finally non-donor group. And this is exactly what we saw. So for psychological ownership, our super donors were experiencing the most psychological ownership towards a blood collection agency, and this was then followed by our donors and lapsed donors, and finally non-donors. And we saw this exact same pattern of results for self-identity as well as intention to donate blood in the future. And so what this graph is telling us overall is that psychological ownership, self-identity, and intention to donate blood are all sensibly increasing with our categories of donation experience. So taking everything into account, what we have here is quite convincing initial evidence for this model of donation behaviour, where past donation behaviour is leading for donors to experience more ownership over their blood collection agency, which is leading them to feel more like they are a donor. And this heightened sense of identity is then leading to subsequent intentions to donate blood. So now we've gained support for psychological ownership within this model of blood donation behaviour. Our next step moving forward is to create novel interventions which can increase blood donors' psychological ownership, separate from past blood donation behaviour. So, specifically within the literature, there are 3 identified routes to experiencing psychological ownership. These are controlling a possession, coming to intimately know a possession, and investing oneself into a possession. So our plan moving forward is to conduct qualitative interviews with blood donors at various stages of their donation career to see if we can establish elements of these antecedents of psychological ownership within their donation habits and routines. We will then use the information gained from these interviews to create and pilot novel interventions to build psychological ownership in blood donors. So, our overall aim moving forward is to develop an effective manipulation of psychological ownership using these antecedents to increase donors' sense of psychological ownership, which will subsequently increase self-identity and intentions to donate blood, which will hopefully see an increase in donation retention behaviour. Thank you very much.